Hi, everyone, and welcome to AXA Arctic Live. It's fantastic to have all of you with us. We've got a fantastic lesson for you today. We are talking about human activity in the Arctic, and very soon we'll be dialing over to Henry, who is head of the Arctic office, and that's based at the British Antarctic Survey. So very much looking forward to speaking to him in just a bit. We have a wonderful array of schools joining us today. They're from the UK, the USA, Canada, France, Ukraine, and India. So welcome to all the students watching from those countries. And we have a couple of very special shout outs. We have Mrs. Sloggett's geography class at Felpham Community College are great. That's from your teacher. And apparently you have worked so hard during this challenging year of COVID-19, and she is very, very proud of you. So a big round of applause and pat on the back to all of the students at Felpham Community College, and I imagine many, many other young people around the world. And then it's a big welcome to Miss Preet's SDG Warriors, and they are dialing in from Bangalore in India. A little bit of admin before we start. The chat app is to the side of the video. So please do put in your questions there. I know some of you have already started. If you would like to add your class name, that's great. Please respect the privacy of young people watching and don't add their names. Then if you would like to keep the video full screen at the front of the classroom, teachers or supporting adults can always get the lesson available on a smartphone. So just go to the same webpage, get it up on a smartphone, and you'll be able to use the chat app there and keep the screen full at the front of the classroom. So there's a couple of bits of admin out of the way at the front. Just one last thing I think is, in fact, we're going to keep the exploratory questions to the end of this live lesson. But if there's anything that needs clarifying during the talk, please do pop it in, and we'll try and get that explained during the talk rather than leaving it towards the end. But it's my great, happy to welcome Henry from the Arctic office to AXA Arctic Live. And hello and good afternoon, Henry.
Jamie, thank you very much. Hello to you and hello to everyone that's watching. It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
And I think we're just going to have a sort of a talk through human activity in the Arctic, some of the sort of Arctic basics, some of the activity that's going on there, and then sort of moving into towards the end, really sort of how the Arctic's being managed and whether it can be managed more sustainably, maybe what some of the challenges are. But maybe we could start off really by sort of saying what the Arctic is, because it's not as easy as the Antarctic, is it?
Yeah, that's right. There are a number of different definitions of the Arctic and what we think of when we talk about the Arctic. I mean, everyone knows it's the cold, frozen place at the top of the globe. But when you look at a map of the Arctic, there are lots of different definitions about what we mean. There's the Arctic Circle itself, which is the kind of the formal definition, which is that point at 66 degrees that goes all the way around. That's the point at which it's kind of completely light or completely dark for at least one day of the year. But you can also think about the area that's frozen all year round, where the ground is frozen all year round. You can think about where the trees grow, because the trees will stop growing a lot further south than actually the Arctic Circle line. So lots of different definitions, and depending on whether you're a scientist or an engineer or a tourist or someone else, you'll have a different view about what the Arctic means for you.
And I think that the map on screen probably showed a whole range of different lines going around. Does it matter which of these is right, or is it only important that sort of each community has a working definition for themselves?
I think there is no one definition. There is a scientific definition of the Arctic, which is that area above the Arctic Circle. But if you're a scientist and you're interested in tree cover, or what's happening to the frozen ground, and is it thawing because of climate change, then you will use your definition rather than just that Arctic Circle line. So different definitions for different people depending on what they need to do.
And talking about the Arctic, I think we've got a sort of map showing the different biomes that we can share. It has a variety of different features which we may not sort of think about when we sort of have this sort of white idea in our mind.
That's absolutely right. There are many different Arctics. The Arctic is an incredibly dynamic and active place, and this isn't the kind of the frozen white continent of Antarctica. There is the frozen part in the sea in the winter, and then there's the Greenland, which is more or less completely covered by ice that's several kilometers thick. But then you have very green, very rich, very kind of fertile in some ways environments, particularly in Russia, where there are enormous forests, and then sort of semi-forest, which is called taiga, which is a Russian word, Taiga, and that's kind of bushes and shrubs and kind of lakes and different areas. So lots of different Arctics, from the kind of the frozen sea, the high Arctic, and then the low Arctic. All covering lots of different environments, all supporting different species and changing and adapting in different ways. A very dynamic and active environment.
And speaking of dynamism, I mean, we think of going back to the whiteness. That's not static either, is it? When we're talking about the frozen sea, and I think we've got a sort of image of a sea ice minimum sort of shot from NASA.
Absolutely. So a really good way I find to think about the Arctic Sea and how frozen it is or isn't is to think of it kind of pulsing throughout the year. So it grows in the winter and it grows out to, I think, the orange line you can probably see there, and then it shrinks down in the summer to the smaller extent. So it's growing and shrinking all year. And what's happening, particularly in the summer, is that each year, or most years, it's shrinking by more. And so that area in the middle gets less and less. And not only does it get less in terms of area, it gets less in terms of thickness as well. So the ice at the North Pole is only probably 2 or 3 meters thick at thickest. And every year there's thinning and melting, and you get melt ponds and all those kind of things. So it's a very fragile, kind of dynamic, changing environment. But if you think of it pulsing backwards and forwards throughout the year, that's a good way.
No, that's fascinating. And you know, just you know, on this conception of the Arctic, it's not this sort of, you know, depopulated wilderness. I mean, it certainly isn't in some places, but people live there. I mean, it's not just visitors.
Absolutely. People have lived in the Arctic. Indigenous people have lived in the Arctic for hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years in some cases. And even people who haven't lived there have visited it for trade and for whaling or sealing originally. There are about 4 million people that live in the Arctic. So about half the population of London, you could say, lives in the Arctic. And of those 4 million people, around 1 in 10% are from indigenous communities. Those would be Inuit or Sami or Nenets people in Russia. So yeah, it's very much home and has been for hundreds, thousands of years for people. And increasingly that is the case in big cities.
And you know, just you know, fascinating to think sort of how long people have been there, and really to sort of like, I think we've got some pictures of those different types of habitation and human occupation of the Arctic. I think the first off is probably our very traditional view is a couple of scientists from the Catlin Arctic Survey, which I think gives an idea of our traditional view of the Arctic. But then we've got sort of a suite of images that we sort of worked on together to show the diversity. And I think the first one we have up is coming from Murmansk, and that in Russia.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right in that there's a very large a very large part of the Arctic is, as we think of it, that traditional image of kind of frozen ice and sea. And it's not to downplay that at all. Kind of about 35% of the whole of Canada is kind of the frozen north. So that those parts kind of exist. But also there are very large cities in the Arctic. So Murmansk, as you say, is a very large city in northern Russia. It has a population of several 100,000, very active shipbuilding industry and associated with mining. There's a railroad that goes there. It's a city that's been there for hundreds of years. So that's just as much the real Arctic as the Arctic of polar bears and walruses and scientists drilling a hole in the ice. Absolutely.
Brilliant. And then we've got a couple of other examples. We've got a sort of more, I think we sort of say a more modern city, sort of Tromsø in Norway.
Yeah, Tromsø in Norway. This city is a couple of 100 miles, I think, north of the Arctic Circle. It's absolutely properly the Arctic, but again, a very modern city, center of tourism in the Arctic. They have a university. There is a cathedral there, shipbuilding industry. If you're lucky to go on a cruise in Norway, then you would stop in here for certain, and they have concert halls and very modern, interconnected city, kind of a real beating heart of Norway. Norway is very proud of the fact that I think it's a quarter of their population or something at least like that live above the Arctic Circle in Norway. So yeah, again, a very active modern city, just as much Arctic as other places.
And then perhaps slightly more sort of traditional, what people may have seen in films of an Arctic town, places like Iqaluit in Nunavut in Canada.
Yes. Again, kind of these communities are traditional indigenous communities, although it will look, I think, in the image here as though these are very modern houses, and people do increasingly live in houses that are like this, as well as maintaining their traditions and their cultures. So these can be communities of a few tens or a few hundreds of houses, very separated from other communities, but very vital and important and kind of full of life.
And just before, the last image we're going to see is of an Inuit community in Greenland. But sort of what countries are in the Arctic? Because it's not just one country. It's not the Arctic is a country.
No, absolutely. There are 8 Arctic states, and if I forget one, you'll have to help me out here, Jamie. But it's the United States, Russia, Canada, Iceland, Finland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, if I've not said that.
Brilliant.
So the 8 Arctic states.
All there. And for Denmark, that's Greenland, or is it Denmark?
Yes, the Kingdom of Denmark has kind of foreign policy responsibility for Greenland. So yes, that's where Denmark comes in.
Brilliant. And so we've got this sort of growing idea that, there's sort of 4 million people in the Arctic. There are vast swathes of wilderness, but why have people come to the Arctic over the centuries? And I think you might have an object that sort of shows some of the riches that people have expected to find in the Arctic over time.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, indigenous communities live in the Arctic because over thousands of years, as the Earth has warmed, the ice sheets have kind of moved northwards, and indigenous communities have been able to kind of cross the sea on land bridges and move north, and they've exploited new hunting ground and developed their kind of lifestyles and communities that way. But people have also seen the Arctic as a treasure trove, originally for animals rather than for minerals. So one of the things that people were hunting as often as they could and as successfully as they could was the narwhal. And so I have a replica here. I hope this is the image you mentioned. I have a replica here of a narwhal tusk. So this is actually a replica, but it's these can get to about kind of 2 meters long, 2 or 3 meters long, and they're actually a tooth. It's a tusk that comes out from the mouth, the lip of a canine. Tooth that comes out from the tooth of a narwhal and grows to this length. And these were incredibly valuable in the Middle Ages and subsequently as trophies. So yeah, kind of happy to share that with you. And these were the kind of things that people would bring back along with walrus skins and kind of whale and seal skins and kind of fish and other things. These would have been the real treasures of the Arctic as they saw them then.
And now there is, I mean, I think we've got a diagram of the sort of overall economy of the Arctic, and it's quite a surprising size, really, as a sort of, we think not much happens there, but a sort of general sort of idea of the size of the Arctic economy.
I don't know. I don't know in terms of kind of figures. You may be able to tell me, but it is very significant, and it's when you have cities like Murmansk and Tromsø, these are cities where they generate their own kind of capacity and engagement. So you'll have doctors and dentists and government offices and ports and financial services and all the kind of things that we associate with modern cities. They just happen to be in the Arctic. And that goes alongside what we might think of as more kind of traditional industries like oil and gas and mining and fishing and those kinds of things, all kind of existing together. But I think probably in big cities, it's probably fair to say that services and kind of that side of the economy, kind of public services, is growing at a faster rate than some of the more traditional industries.
And I mean, Henry, if we can just take the sort of classes watching through some of the sort of what we might think of some of the main sort of areas. And I know you mentioned the services bit, and surprisingly, I think the services economy is the biggest section of the economy, but there are other sections that probably, from a sustainability point of view, that may feel a little bit more important or concerning. I don't know what the right kind of word is, but one of the things that is in the news a lot is the exploitation or exploration of the Arctic region for oil and gas. And I think we've got a map sort of potential sort of hydrocarbon deposits in the region. Is that something that's new, or is that something that's been sort of happening for some time?
It's a good point. It is something that has been happening for quite a long time. People have been exploiting oil for 100 years or so on land in Russia. So this isn't something that's brand new, but kind of the scale of people's ambition in more recent years has been different. So people have been thinking about pushing offshore, so leaving the land and drilling for oil or exploring for oil and gas, kind of in the deep sea. And there's definitely more of a concern about what happens if you find oil and gas in ice-covered waters, because what happens if an iceberg comes and affects your oil rig or your gas rig? What happens if the boat that's collecting the oil and gas from the rig or the pipeline gets damaged in some way? There's a lot of concern about if you have an oil spill underneath ice, how you can then seek to remedy that. We saw in the Gulf of Mexico 10, 15 years ago how difficult it is to clear up kind of an oil spill, and that's in kind of warm, fairly calm conditions in the Caribbean, never mind in the far north of the Arctic. It's important to say that there isn't at the moment a lot of that kind of exploration happening in the Arctic. There are some, but most of the volume of oil and gas production is on land.
And there seems to be a certain irony that the opportunities afforded to new exploration for hydrocarbons in the Arctic is because of the use of hydrocarbons and the generation, of carbon emissions, which is, pushing the ice further back.
Yes, that's right. When you think of those kind of big diesel-powered icebreakers in the Arctic that are ploughing channels for ships to kind of explore new routes in the Arctic, then yes, it's carbon being used to kind of provide access to more carbon for people in different parts of the world that may not have had that access before.
I think we'll come to some of the sustainability challenges and where we are as an international community on that in a bit. But just to sort of to look at sort of briefly a sort of few other sort of points. There's I think fishing and tourism were two other sectors that stood out as not controversial, but areas of interest in terms of management.
Yeah, I mean, fishing is one of the most traditional industries in the Arctic. So it's what indigenous communities would have done right from the very start of their time in the Arctic. And then it would be the industry that people from the UK and France and Germany and the Netherlands and others would undertake on kind of long fishing and whaling and sealing missions up to the Arctic. but increasingly now it's done on an even more commercial basis. Fish farms are very active in the Arctic. So in the fjords of Norway, fish farming, particularly of salmon, is a really large industry with many successes, but also some concerns around the health of salmon. And there is a kind of fishing is adapting to climate change in the Arctic. So we're seeing new species come into the Arctic that we didn't see before. You think of those warm waters from the Atlantic kind of surging up towards the Arctic. That's part of the natural cycle. And they are increasingly bringing with them mackerel and Atlantic cod and other things that you didn't used to get in the Arctic, and now you do. And in one way, that's a fantastic bonanza for those fishermen in the Arctic. But in another sense, what species are they pushing out? How is it affecting the ecosystem? How is all that changing? So yeah, very interesting with fishing.
I mean, I think you mentioned mackerel there. It's almost a semi-tropical fish, and I know a couple of years ago, people in Svalbard saying that they were starting to catch mackerel off Svalbard, so even pretty far north.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the kind of the image that people can see behind you there is of the UK's Arctic station, and that's only kind of a couple of 100 meters away from a piece of open water, although it doesn't look like it there. And that open water leads into the warm Gulf Stream, and so yeah, there's a really good chance that mackerel and other species will come into the fjord, and these things happen quite quickly. So you can, in the course of a couple of seasons, go from no mackerel in the fjord to suddenly a lot, and that's a big change. These things can be rapid changes.
Well, and probably some very happy seals as well.
Yeah, you're probably right.
And then the last sector to look at really is tourism. And I know there's been a sort of huge growth in Arctic tourism, and especially in the cruise industry, as more people have almost a fascination in the natural world.
Yeah, that's right. The cruise industry, both in the Arctic and the Antarctic, has grown enormously over the last couple of decades. As you say, people's fascination with the Arctic is driven by programs like Frozen Planet and the other thing. People want to see these things, and although the trips are very expensive, some people can afford them and they're keen to go on them. So yeah, there are a lot of visits now from people on cruise ships. The majority of people in their visits to the Arctic will stay on the cruise ship. So it's relatively self-contained. They will set off from the port, cruise around, see different things, and then go back again. But there are smaller ships, kind of 200-300 people, that will land people on shore. There are very strict rules regarding what people can do on shore and how they have to respect wildlife and not get too close and respect cultural objects and kind of be generally very careful. So it's not an unregulated industry. It's kind of very heavily regulated and lots of very good practice, including with people doing beach cleanups as part of their cruise and their tourism. So they'll land on a beach, they'll see the seals and the walrus and maybe a polar bear in the distance, and as part of that landing, they will clear up beach litter, so fishing nets or bottles and other things. So that's a way of giving something back. But yes, there are risks with tourism. There have been cruise ships which have run aground and cruise ships which have got into trouble in the past.
And because I know there's an international operators agreement in the Antarctic. I hadn't realised there was a similar agreement or legislation in the Arctic.
Yeah, there's two things. Sort of all the kind of the responsible tour operators in the north, anyone that lands people on shore, are part of an organisation that provides a set of kind of guidelines and standards to look after people and make sure people are doing the right thing. And then also there is a new shipping regulation brought in by the United Nations, the International Maritime Organization, which provides higher, not massively higher, but higher standards for shipping and safety, with recognizing that if a ship does get into trouble right in the high Arctic, there are very few other ships around that can come and rescue them.
And Henry, sort of now moving really towards the sort of two other viewpoints on the Arctic and then towards managing the Arctic. The two viewpoints would be wonderful to have your insight on. First of all is traditional indigenous lives and how those might be changing. And the second is then the viewpoint of science. I think we've got a photograph I think it's from Greenland, of an Inuit community with a sled laden with polar bear furs and seal furs and all these. And I think I could see behind you someone wearing polar bear trousers.
Yeah.
And these things might, shock people initially, where they think, well, how come, the polar bear is this icon of conservation? How come, this is still happening?
Yes, it's not an uncontroversial issue. That's for sure. But the indigenous communities, Inuit and Nenets and Sami, who live in the Arctic, they've always lived there. They've never lived anywhere else. And the only way they've been able to live there and make their art and their culture and their livelihoods is by sustainably exploiting what they find around them. And what they find around them are bears and seals and walrus and reindeer and other things. That's what there is there. So there's a very strong recognition within those communities and increasingly internationally that as long as the numbers of animals that they are taking are sustainable, and that they're not damaging the overall population, then that is an acceptable, responsible, appropriate thing to do. Because the alternative is that they lose all that tradition and that culture, and rather that you have to fly in lots of unhealthy food or kind of food that has to travel thousands and thousands of miles to get there, that they have no kind of cultural reference to. And in the same way that we hope and expect to be able to choose the lifestyles that we want to live, they have the same thing, and they have that kind of right and responsibility.
And in terms of sustainable management, what voice do these communities have, and are those voices becoming increasingly loud or urgent?
Yes, it varies a lot, to be honest. It varies a lot depending on where the communities are. So in Canada, the population that we think of as now as an Inuit population, they don't just live in the north, they own it, basically. They have claims and land rights to that land. So to a large extent, what happens in those areas is governed by them, not without reference back to kind of federal Canada. There is a kind of give and take on certain issues, but they have a lot of kind of power and responsibility. In other parts of the world, it's not quite the same, and they don't have as much power to manage the resources locally that they would like. But increasingly, there is a feeling that in these indigenous areas, there is a responsibility for people not just to talk to the people that are there and listen to what they want, but actually for the people themselves to choose what happens there, and not just to choose other people to do it for them, but to choose it and they do it. So they manage the land, they do the research, they they take part actively in managing what is theirs.
Fascinating. I think we're just going to. I really want to get into the sort of management bit. We've got a lot of talks this week on science, so I'm just going to sort of touch on the fact that there is. From your own personal role, from the institution you sit within, and the sort of images behind you of the importance of the perspective of science in terms of understanding the Arctic. If you could touch on that briefly, and then we'll talk a little bit about sort of management.
Yes, very much. I mean, there's we see programs like Frozen Planet about the Arctic, and we think about polar bears and walruses and kind of the forests, and we think we know a lot about them. But actually, this is a very understudied part of the world. We know far less about the Arctic than we do about other parts of the world, because it's still, despite climate change and warming, very difficult to work there. And as we spoke about at the start, there are very many different parts of the Arctic. So by studying one part, that's fine, but you can't always say that change you're seeing is the same as somewhere else. So it's really important that we work internationally in the Arctic. So much of what we do, and so many of the images you can see behind me, are actually researchers from the UK working in collaboration with researchers from other countries to really understand what's going on. So we provide a ship, someone else provides a plane. in particular that froze a ship into the middle of the Arctic Ocean over the course of a winter, and it moved across the top of the Arctic during the winter. And that's a real international collaboration between kind of dozens of countries. And that's how you answer the really big questions, by everyone working together.
And so coming to management, I mean, that information is obviously crucial to sort of policy decisions and wider discussions around the Arctic. Because I mean, I just want to sort of how does that internationalism of science then contrast with the, I don't want to say nationalism, but the sort of territorial claim discussions that are going on side by side? I think we've got an amazing map from Durham University looking at the claims in the Arctic.
Yes, this is a really complicated map. So don't worry about too much about the detail of it, but just think about the complexity of it without the detail. But essentially, the areas you can see in yellow here are around the edges of the map are the countries, and then each country gets an area of 200 nautical miles out from its territorial waters, which is its basically. So it can decide who fishes there, what happens to the seabed, if there are any minerals underneath, all of that it gets to decide. But outside that area, and that those parts you can see in the middle of the map, which are kind of hatched and crossed, those are the areas where people can potentially expand their claim. So if you can prove that your coastline kind of goes out from your coast all the way in one single feature out beyond the 200 nautical miles, you can say that that part of the North Pole is Greenland's or Canada's or Russia's. So there's a lot of discussion at the moment and a lot of work going on by those countries to prove that the continental shelf is theirs. It won't go to a court of law. It will still have to be for the countries themselves in the end to decide which bits are whose. But it's not an unusual process. All around the world, these kinds of things are happening, and it's a peaceful scientific process. It's not something that we get involved in because the UK, we don't have a claim here, so we do other science rather than this science. But if you were in Canada or Russia or Denmark, Greenland, it's a hot topic for sure. Who owns the North Pole?
Good. And then so in terms of because there is this thing is that there's these 8 Arctic nations, and yet a lot of us, I say, without any basis for that, but my sense is that a lot of people feel they have a stake in the future of the Arctic. How does that work where you have the international science community, you have national discussions or bilateral discussions over ownership, and then you have this sort of almost sort of sense of a global commons type to the Arctic as well, especially the high Arctic? Yes,
definitely. And I think that's increasingly being recognized by kind of the procedures and processes that now apply in the Arctic. So when you think of the end of the Cold War between the US and Russia in the late 1980s, the Arctic then had been heavily militarized. And as the Cold War ended and the US and Russia pulled their forces back from the North Pole, there was a sense of opportunity. And so what was created then was essentially the Arctic Council, which is the 8 Arctic states, plus a series of observers states, so like the UK and France and Italy and China, as well as some NGOs, Greenpeace, WWF, kind of others are observers. And they look at and provide guidelines and best practice for some of the sustainability issues which apply to the Arctic. So they don't regulate oil and gas and fishing and defense and security, those kind of issues, but they do look at sustainability issues, which is really important.
Henry, it's been absolutely amazing. I could keep on asking you questions, huge amounts of different questions about sort of human activity. I find it absolutely fascinating personally, but I know we have some specific questions from classes.
Sure. Yeah.
Watching online. This is from Felpham Community College, and they're asking what human activity is most concerning in the Arctic.
I think that's a really good question. Thank you, Felpham, for your question. I suppose it's what you mean by concerning. So if I was an indigenous person in the Arctic, then I would be very concerned if someone was going to drill where I didn't want them to drill, or if they were going to make a dam where I herded my reindeer, or if they said that there were too many reindeer and I had to get rid of some of them because it was causing overgrazing. So there's what concerns you when you live in a particular place and your culture and your traditions are impacted. But if you're living in the UK, you might have those concerns too on behalf of those communities, or you might be more worried about plastic pollution, say, in the Arctic. So it's really, I mean, you will have seen this, Jamie, yourself, in Svalbard, and I've seen it there too, in other places. When you walk along a beach and you see pieces of fishing net or plastic pollution, and you know that it's not come from the town round the corner, it's come across the North Sea or across the Pacific, or it's been in the sea for decades, and it started off as a big bit and it's got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's filtered into the system. So it's the things you can see, like is someone building a reservoir where you don't want them to, but it's that kind of semi-invisible pollution and changes, which I think are, I would say is equally concerning, but for different reasons.
Thank you very much, Henry. There's a very interesting question come through from FCG Warriors in Bangalore, and that's, has COVID had an impact on the Arctic ecosystem?
That's another really good question. I don't know whether COVID has an impact on the Arctic ecosystem itself, on kind of the animals and that food chain, that pyramid. I don't know about that. Fishing will have continued, and fish farming will have continued, and all of those kinds of activities. So I don't think so. There may well have been. What happens in some places in the Arctic is that people from outside the Arctic will go hunting, trophy hunters, polar bear or reindeer or caribou or other things. So they may not have been able to travel into the Arctic because of COVID restrictions, but that's a fairly small number. What has been different is the impact of COVID on people in the Arctic. So particularly in the Canadian Arctic, there's been a terrible history of communities of the North not having access to proper healthcare for decades and decades in the past, and that's led to terrible health outcomes, physical and mental health outcomes in the Arctic for those communities. But in recognition of that, those are the communities that have now been prioritized for COVID vaccinations. So there's very high rates now of COVID vaccinations in the Canadian Arctic, because they've recognized this is a vulnerable population that needs to be kind of protected. And that's a complete 180-degree turnaround from how people saw Inuit health in the past. So that's an interesting kind of aspect to this.
Thank you, Henry. We've got a couple more questions, but we've got obviously students concerned about or have read about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. And you've touched on this already, and I think there's been sort of debate around what's going to happen there. But how would or will oil drilling impact a wildlife refuge such as that in Alaska?
Yes, I have to say I don't know the detail of that particular kind of issue and that case, but one of the things people will be thinking about are the risks that are involved, and the risks if you're the local population, and also the risks if you are the people that are responsible for cleaning up something that goes wrong. Because the truth is that in the oil industry and the gas industry, like most industries, fishing as well, if something can go wrong, eventually it probably will. Not everywhere, but eventually it probably will. So if you're thinking about the impact of drilling in a particular wildlife refuge, wherever that is, those are the things that you would want to think about. If something goes wrong, do you find out about it quickly enough? And if you find out about it, can you do something about it? Are there particularly as shale gas in the US and Poland and elsewhere becomes more affordable. So the cost to companies to exploit oil and gas in the Arctic is much more than it was kind of before. So the value of these leases is not as worthwhile as it once was. So I think many people will be surprised if, with the push for renewables and increasing cheapness of shale gas, whether all these leases get actually used in the end.
And just Henry, just to remind the audience what you mean by a lease. It's not a house you're leasing.
Yeah, sorry, a lease. So what tends to happen in oil and gas exploration is that because you don't know always that there is something below the ground, so you will say to a company, we'll give you a license, an option, if you like, on this piece of ground. So we'll give it to you for a certain number of years. And if you find oil and gas there, then that's fine. We'll give you another license and we can have a proper arrangement about it. So it's not an agreement to take all the oil and gas you can find, at least. It's an opportunity to look for it, basically.
Brilliant, thank you. And so, really important question, which I really like, is what can we do at our school to help the issues facing the Arctic? We had that idea of sort of the Arctic as a commons, so that obviously people's feeling that they want to do something to help.
Yes, that's a really good point, and a really important one. As we sort of said at the start, the Arctic is a dynamic system. So what happens in the Arctic does not stay there. The Arctic is an absolutely integral part of the Earth's kind of sort of air conditioning system, if you like. It vents heat out of the world, and the Arctic is warming by 3 times the speed of the rest of the world. So that will have effects on the Arctic, on the rest of the world too. But that warming in the Arctic is not being caused in the Arctic, it's being caused by us outside the Arctic. So all the things that we should be doing anyway about reducing our carbon footprint and reducing greenhouse gases and living as sustainably as we can, all of those will have an impact on the Arctic because it will reduce the rate at which the Arctic warms. And that means then that it's kind of has a more beneficial effect back in for the rest of the globe.
Henry, very sadly, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for being part of AXA Arctic Live.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Jamie.
And maybe just one last thing is just a sort of message to young people is what do you think they should find out more about the Arctic? How would you advise them to sort of explore the Arctic, from their classrooms, as it were?
Yes, I would say that whatever you're interested in, there is some connection to the Arctic for you. If you're interested in science, there's a connection. If you're interested in maths and physics, if you're interested in people and history and geography and engineering and all of those kind of things, there is something for you in the Arctic. There might even be a job for you in the Arctic at some point. So whatever your interest is there is something in the Arctic that will connect through it. So kind of follow your interests and there'll be something there for you.
Brilliant. And look on the British Antarctic Survey job board.
Yes, there are always jobs here. Good candidates are always welcome. Yes, absolutely, definitely.
So both north and south, but just to say thank you so much to all those classes who've been watching. Some fantastic questions. And Henry, thank you very, very much for sharing your insights and experience and helping show us how dynamic and varied the Arctic is, rather than a mysterious white zone at the top of the planet. So big thank you. But for now, it's goodbye from AXA Arctic Live. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.